intellectual tradition. For those of you who are new, and there are 4 of my students here who are, the forum consists of faculty talking about their recently published or soon to be published books in any way related in one way or another with the Catholic intellectual tradition. And this one definitely is. It takes place on Teams, usually monthly, on Wednesdays at 4 p.m. And the forum is sponsored by the University Core, the Catholic Studies Program, the Catholic Studies Center, and Immaculate Conception Seminary School of Theology. It is an exciting expression of harvesting our treasures, and our faculty scholars truly are among those treasures. So in light of that, we're pleased to welcome our first presenter for this spring semester of 2024, Dr. Jeff Morrow, Professor of Undergraduate Theology in Immaculate Conception Seminary School of Theology. He will be presenting on his recent book, A Catholic Guide to the Old Testament, co-edited with Jeff Cavins, Bill Rocha, and Andrew Swafford from Ascension Press. And Dr. Morrow's prior books include Modern Biblical Criticism as a Tool of Statecraft, co-authored with Scott Hahn, Alfred Loethi, if I'm saying that correctly.
Loethi, yeah.
Loethi, okay. And Modern Biblical Studies from the Catholic University of America Press, and Murmuring Against Moses that you presented on last year, The Contentious History and Contested Future of Pentateuchal Studies, co-authored with John S. Bergsma, and many articles. Dr. Morrow, besides teaching in the Immaculate Conception Seminary School of Theology, also teaches regularly in the Core, for which we are grateful. His expertise in biblical scholarship is a great gift to us in the Core and at Seton Hall overall. So to introduce more specifically Dr. Morrow, that was my general introduction, we turn to Monsignor Jerry McCarron, Rector Dean of Immaculate Conception Seminary School of Theology. And I also want to mention that there will be time for questions and answers after the presentation led by Maribel Landrau, Assistant Director of the Core. Monsignor McCarron?
Thank you. And Professor Morrow has been a tremendous gift to the seminary. And he's been with us since the beginning of our undergraduate program, when the school moved from being just a graduate school to one that has undergraduates too. And so, as one of the founding professors, there was a lot of frontier to cross and frontier to clear. Not an easy thing, and that brings to my mind, Dr. Morrow's generosity. His scholarship is amazing. The amount of things he publishes, both on a highly scholarly level and then sometimes in popular distillation. But his service is incredible, and he does things with alacrity when asked, and with a true spirit of service, even though he has so many pressures, on him from his scholarly work and his teaching and his life as a husband and father as well. And his teaching is greatly appreciated. You saw testimony to that from Maribel if you looked at the description for today. And that's just one example of many who benefited so much from his teaching. And again, an ability to take scholarly things that might be a little bit abstruse for some students and bring them home to the heart without compromising the intellectual qualities there. So we really look forward to your presentation, Dr. Morrow.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for the warm introductions and all the kind words. So this will be one of those kind of popular works that we're going to discuss today. It's not a real work of scholarship. This is this Catholic Guide to the Old Testament. It was really kind of a great process working on this, right? So there were 4 of us that were co-authors. Jeff Cavins. So it's actually interesting. The background is kind of interesting. This is kind of a unique project. Typically for intros to the Bible, everybody is usually a specialist in the Bible. And other than Andy Swafford, we really weren't, right? So Andy Swafford, he kind of specialized in Old Testament and Semitics in his theological work. I think he even did a master's in that before his doctorate. But he also does a lot of New Testament. Biff Roca he's an expert in catechesis. He did his dissertation on the Baltimore Catechism. So he's actually a catechetical expert in communicating the faith how that's been done historically, how to do it today. He does a lot with Bible as well, but that's not his area of scholarship. I do mostly history of interpretation. That's what I've done a lot of my work in. So it's been nice to actually do primary text material and summaries. And then Jeff Cavins is an amazing popularizer, wonderful popular speaker and writer on scripture and on the faith. So to kind of come together and work on this project, all four of us together, was really kind of a treat. And so the impetus for this began with Jeff Cavins, the Great Adventure Bible series he did with Ascension Press and the Bible Timeline, which gets a lot of criticism, especially in the scholarly communities. What's amazing to me is whenever I go to scholarly associations associated with the Bible, mainly Catholic, because the non-Catholics tend not to be as aware of his work in the Bible Timeline, it's very criticized. And yet whenever I go to parishes anywhere, everybody all over the country tends to know about it. And so, I mean, family members, like from my wife's family, friends, they've all been using this and they found it very helpful, because I think for average lay Catholics in the pews, the Bible, especially the Old Testament, can seem very difficult to get into. And maybe they'll start in Genesis, and then when they get to Leviticus, it's kind of hard. Or they get to First Chronicles with chapter after chapter of genealogies. They're not sure what to do with all of this. And so one of the benefits of this popular way of doing it is to walk in a kind of a somewhat chronological framework, not what we did with the guide, but the Bible timeline. It takes it to kind of, it's obviously there's arguments about when things were dated, when they even take place, but it tries to kind of do a tentative timeline to kind of situate the stories in a rough chronological framework within the broader history of salvation history, so that readers can kind of orient how do these things relate, at least in the form in which we have them in the canonical whole. So that's kind of how that got started. And then Father Mike Schmitz did the Bible in a Year podcast, and it just took off. Like non-Catholics, Catholics, I know Jewish members of the family, I know secular atheists, agnostics, Protestants from college, friends I know, all sorts of backgrounds that you wouldn't expect, downloading this podcast, listening to it almost every day. And so it was at one point, it was the #1 podcast of any podcast anywhere in the world. It was kind of incredible, actually. And so they had this idea to do this introduction to the Old Testament. And so our big, I was going to say competitor, but that's not quite accurate. The big one out there, if you're familiar with it, is the Catholic Introduction to the Old Testament. I think it's called A Catholic Introduction to the Bible, the Old Testament, by my dear friends, Brant Petrie and John Bergsma, who's also a co-author of mine in other contexts. And that's a wonderful textbook. I was using that as drafts when they had sent me drafts of that for some of my own lectures, to prepare my own lectures in master's level courses on the introduction to the Old Testament. I can't sing its praises highly enough, but really it's mostly envisioned as a textbook. That's so if you take a seminary class, you can really use Petrie and Bergsma's book in any course. Pentateuch, it covers the entire Old Testament, but you can really take those sections and use them in prophets, historical books, in any kind of intro Old Testament. And you're going to get great resources. You're going to get kind of modern scholarly approaches to the text, traditional approaches, strengths and weaknesses to both, how it's used in the lectionary. It's kind of wonderful. But it's a bit intimidating for your average lay Catholic in the pews who maybe doesn't want a whole course on scripture, but they just kind of want to orient themselves a little bit. They want to go a little bit more beyond what you got in, say, the Bible in a Year podcast. And so that's what we did in this Catholic Guide to the Old Testament. It is a very simple walk through the Old Testament. So we cover every book of the Catholic Old Testament. And some of you students may or may not know, right? So Catholics, Orthodox Christians, and Protestants have different Old Testaments, right? So that's kind of one of the things we have to talk about as well. We have an intro on the canonization process of the Old Testament. And so Catholics have 7 books more than most Protestant Old Testaments have, right? First Maccabees, Second Maccabees, Judith, Tobit, Baruch, Wisdom of Solomon, and Sirach. And our version of Esther and of Daniel is also larger. representing, at least for Esther, what you find in the most popular Greek translation of the Old Testament that we know of as the Septuagint. For Daniel, actually, we don't take it from the Septuagint. We take it from Theodosian's translation. That's what Jerome used when he translated the Vulgate. So there are different Old Testaments. They're very similar. They're almost identical, but those 7 books and those larger portions of Daniel and Esther. And there are some Orthodox traditions actually that use other books. Some of them will use First Enoch, Book of Jubilees, for example. So there's a bit of a diversity when it comes to the Old Testament canon. For the New Testament, almost all Christians have a 27-book New Testament in common. I believe the Armenian Orthodox are unique in having 3rd Corinthians, so they have a 28-book New Testament. So we're kind of introducing this, diversity to a Catholic audience and walking through kind of each book of the Old Testament. What's the basic summary? How are these read? And so we wanted to kind of give ordinary Catholics an intro to the Old Testament to kind of encourage them to actually read the Old Testament so that it kind of takes away some of the fear. And so that, one, they can understand on its own, what do we know about God? Just from the Old Testament alone, there's a lot we can know about God, about who God is, even from a Catholic perspective. And then 2, the importance of how the Old Testament, as we understand it, points forward to the New Testament. Right? So there's a very important emphasis on typology that we bring up in this Old Testament, which you also get in Petrie and Bergsma's more massive and dense volume, but you often don't get in ordinary introductions to the Old Testament that you might get. Like when I took biblical courses at a state school at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, I took courses in the Old Testament. One was called The Religions of Ancient Israel. One was called Archaeology in the Bible, but it focused on the Old Testament. We had Introduction to the Bible, focusing on the Old Testament. I took several actually courses that focused just on the Old Testament. And none of the books that we used, the introductory textbooks, really dealt with typology at all because they saw that as foreign to the Old Testament. But from a Catholic perspective, although the Old Testament has its own value and worth, and it is inspired, right? We could say apart from typology, there's also that level of typological reading, which is important. It's not insignificant. So we try to bring out some of those ways in which the Old Testament points forward to the New. And then in addition, we have the benefit of some maps and charts that help break apart certain things that might be interesting for average readers to see what, where the kingdoms were, the split with North and South, the temple, the geography. And then there's little essays. We have an essay on one that I was very involved in on the law and how we understand the law in the Old Testament. We can divide it up into ceremonial, right? Right. So the moral law, loving God, then loving neighbor, the juridical, loving neighbors ourself, and how those laws might change, right? So you think about the gleaning laws in the Old Testament, right? That doesn't go away. But if you're living in inner city Newark, how do we help the poor in our midst? Well, we're not farming wheat, right? They're not going to glean the wheat, but we have to apply that in some sense, right? So that law doesn't just go away. So the question becomes, how do we apply that in our own context? So there's a lot we could talk about. It might be interesting if you had, there's questions or something that in the area that you want me to talk more about. But that's basically what we did in this book, is we're trying to get interested lay Catholics to kind of basically get interested in the Old Testament and understand that the Old Testament is not just a book for Judaism, right? It's also a book for Christians. It's essential. In fact, I'm just going to pull out, since I'm on film here. As most of you know, there's a Catholic Bible, right? And I do this with my students, and they're often surprised in the interlevel courses. But in my right hand, this is the New Testament. And in my left, this is the Old. It's a much larger portion. The overwhelming majority of the Christian Bible, whether it's Catholic, Protestant, or other, is the Old Testament. And we share a lot of that in common with Judaism. So that's how I would open up this discussion.
Would Dr. Morrow, I'm going to ask just a question because I'm thinking, I know we have some students here. If you could just define typology, because I'm not sure the students
Sure.
will know what you mean by that.
Yeah, so typology is traditionally understood as the way in which Christians read the Old Testament as pointing forward to Jesus, the church, and the sacraments. So sometimes you'll hear it described as allegory. Now, we usually use the term allegorical interpretation in a much broader sense. Often it's a metaphorical reading or a spiritual reading. And so there's a lot written on how early Christians read the Bible. And so they usually, I mean, there'll be a lot of, it's more than this. In the medieval period, you hear about the fourfold senses of Scripture. Christians were doing a lot more than that, but that becomes, especially by the time of St. Thomas Aquinas, that becomes an important way of understanding this. And the current Catechism of the Catholic Church, I believe, is paragraphs 115 to 119, also discusses this in kind of really clear, concise, in a very clear and concise way. And that is really, there's two senses in this way. There's the literal sense, which involves the sense of the words, right? Then there's the spiritual sense, right? So the literal sense, if the words are intended to be, if they're a metaphor, it would be reading it as a metaphor. That would be part of the literal sense, at least as Thomas Aquinas would use it. So we misunderstand this sometimes. Then there's the spiritual sense. The spiritual is grounded in the literal. You can't, right, get to the spiritual level, at least in traditional Catholic thought from Thomas Aquinas, at least, and in the Catechism, without reference to the literal. So I often will begin conversations in biblical interpretation. Do Catholics read the Bible literally? Do they read all of it literally? And the answer, depending on what you mean by that, is yes. At least we do according to the literal sense. We may not read it literalistically, but we do read all of the Bible according to its literal sense. Then the spiritual sense is traditionally then divided into three types. The first is allegory or typology, reading the old in light of its fulfillment in the new. The second is the moral sense, or sometimes you might hear a fancy term, tropological. And that's where you apply the text to your life, right? Where, you're trying to live a more godly life, more righteous. That's perhaps one of the most important ways of reading the Bible. And the third spiritual sense is the anagogical, which is where we read the Scripture to help elevate our mind to contemplate heavenly realities. Sometimes you hear about the Protestant Reformation, the Reformers, did away with the senses. Well, it's true they don't talk about the senses in the same way, but I think especially with Calvin and some of the others, you kind of have this literal sense that then gets expanded, where typology becomes in some passages the literal sense. And obviously they're applying it to their lives. So you see that going on as well, the moral sense as well. That answers more than what you asked, but.
No, that's great. Thank you. That's very helpful.
Anyone would like to ask Dr. Morrow a question?
Or if there's a part you're more interested in, I could talk about. Please, Todd. Oh, I'm sorry. You're the moderator.
Dr. Stockdale, go ahead.
Yes, I'm going to wait for Maribel to call on me, Jeff. I'm not going to jump in there without her direction and leadership and guidance through this. Thank you so much for this. Fascinated by this text. I think I had two questions. I like this idea of the Catholic guide to the Old Testament. I guess I heard you say it's intended for Catholics, but is there anything else that makes it Catholic as opposed to Orthodox or Protestant or something else in the text itself?
I would say, to answer that first, I think that's your first question. To answer the first question is, I would say the big thing is not just the intention, because I think we would love for non-Catholics to read it as well, but it starts with that as a starting point, right? So when I talk to scholars, a lot of scholars, you look at, well, the dogmatic tradition, any doctrinal tradition obscures the meaning of Scripture. You don't start there. You start with the text, by which I would say they usually mean their own kind of modern hermeneutics and assumptions and whatever. It kind of functions as their doctrine. These methods. But I disagree. I think in the Christian tradition, there's a long-standing sense in which the doctrine clarifies. So we believe that if we believe it's true, then it helps us understand the Scripture rightly. So we start from a position of Catholic doctrine is true, of the Catholic dogmatic tradition. We're not dealing with all the dogmas, but they may come up, and we're not proving, we're not using proof texts, we're not arguing for, we're assuming. And we're trying to help, intentionally Catholics understand how these things relate. So we may mention the Trinity here and there, And others would say, oh, that's inappropriate in an introduction to the Old Testament. Why would you mention the Trinity? Well, because we believe the God is triune, and this is so we start with that assumption. And the second is the canon. We assume that the Book of Tobit is inspired and part of the canon, things like that, or Judith, and then and then the third I would say is we rely probably pretty heavy on some of the Catholic theological tradition in the sense of, so not formal dogma, but in, for example, St. Thomas Aquinas, we rely probably a lot heavier on St. Thomas Aquinas's interpretations of Scripture than you might get in your average, say, evangelical commentary on Scripture. Does that help? Does that make sense?
That's very helpful. That's very helpful, Jeff. Thank you. And then Dr. Morrow, my second question, maybe not as much of a question as just a comment, and just maybe to get your perspective from it. This is from my experience teaching the core, teaching the honors program with students, and a lot of students come in with this idea that I would call, I guess, a more Marcion view of the Old Testament. That this is a devil god of sorts. This is not the God of Christianity or anything like that. I can very safely assume that's not the Catholic teaching, right? And so I wonder where this is coming from our students.
That's a great question. I don't know where. I mean, that's certainly what we're not trying to do that in this book.
I know you're not.
Although there was a reviewer, there was a critic that wrote back that thought that we were doing something like that, even though we're obviously, affirming the inspiration of the Scriptures. And Marcion, as you know, did not believe any of these books, belonged in Christianity. And Otto von Harnack, Friedrich Delitzsch, and others in late 19th century, early 20th century agreed, right? Delitzsch at one point argued we should replace the Old Testament for Christians with German folklore, and they weren't alone in that. So I don't know where the view comes from, but I've encountered, just coming from a Jewish background myself, first as an evangelical and then Catholic. I mean, I encountered it in all contexts. I mean, not the very well-educated evangelicals, but I encountered it a lot where Christians often, whether they're Catholic or not, don't know what to do with the Old Testament. And Jesus fulfilled it, therefore, that means it just all goes away. It's not that important. And I often tell people that even apart from Christ, we can learn a lot about, even just think about the Joseph narratives. There's a lot about God's providence and love and care that you can just there alone. There's a lot. I mean, the book of Genesis, but all throughout, about God's loving mercy. And I often hear this in Catholic and Protestant contexts. You often hear this, the vengeful God of the Old Testament, the unmerciful, and then the loving, merciful God of the New, and why has God changed? And I like to kind of throw a little, wood on the fire there. And so just to poke a little bit, I say, well, the God of the old forgives again and again and again, and is constantly reaching out. And there's no hell, right? We don't hear any explicit burning in hell for eternity in the old. Okay, people die, but there's nothing about, well, then they're burning in hell forever, right? And in the new, we have this sense of eternal hell all of a sudden. And it's like, wow, in some ways, right? But the reality, I think, is it's obviously the same God. And I think there's love and mercy throughout. But I don't know where that comes from, but it's there.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Morrow. That's fantastic.
I have a student that while teaching Augustine and the Old Testament, the New Testament, they were not by the same, the student called it an angry teenager. The God of the Old Testament was like an angry teenager. I have a question myself, Dr. Morrow. The way you composed this guide is not like a commentary. It's the book, in lack of better words, your opinion, how it's used from the altar, from the podium?
No, not exactly. This is more like, it's an introduction. So I think of it more as what we did is, and although our names aren't attached to the chapters, we actually drafted different chapters. So some we're like, in a sense of we're just four, co-authors, but the reality is some of us have more of a hand in other parts than others. And, but the way it's intended is it's more background. So you'll have an introduction to Job, and it's trying to kind of give you an overview of what the book of Job is like. And then we'll have other essays that are more thematic, like an introduction to the world of the patriarchs. Things I don't remember actually if there's an essay on that, but there's things like that there, right? Does that help? So the idea is that you would use this as maybe a reference. You could read it cover to cover, or you could use it as a reference. Like, I want to know more about that. And if you're preaching, you could do it, more on, I'm preaching on this topic. I want to learn more. Personally, I would say that a preacher who wants to be well prepared, who really wants to know the material, right, would do better with Petrie and Bergsma's volume to really have a deep dive in the backgrounds. Ours is really meant for more, this is my opinion, maybe the publisher won't be happy with this, but in my opinion, ours is really meant for, it's like the next step. Okay, you've read the Bible, or you haven't read the Bible, but you're learning more about it, and you want to understand, you want some framework to understand the Old Testament, right? I actually have like a set list of popular sources I kind of think through in my head, right? I'll just tell you what I usually do, and I'll tell you where this would fit in my mind, is I usually start people really simple. I start them with John Bergsma's Bible Basics for Catholics and New Testament Basics for Catholics. It's got stick figures. I use it the catechesis with my own children, but it's really good. He's a top scholar, but he communicates so well. So I start with that. Then I go to Scott Hahn's A Father Who Keeps His Promises, because even though it's Pentateuch heavy, but he gets into the New Testament, and we can debate different interpretations, I think it gives a good intro to the opposite of what you just mentioned about the angry father of the old, but rather showing how God is like a father, lovingly meeting people where they're at. And so really what we have in the wilderness period, it's the people that are like a wild teenager. And God is kind of working with them and giving concessions and lowering the bar to work with the teenage son to help them grow and mature and that sort of thing. And so that's where I go next. And then now what I would do is from that point is I usually recommend the Ignatius Catholic Study Bible, which the notes are just fantastic. And then I would probably put our intro to the Old, right? And then I would put Brant and John Petrie and Bergsma's,
the big one.
The big one.
Mm-hmm.
And I might put Hahn's Catholic Bible Dictionary in between those, which is also very good and helpful.
Any other comments, questions for Dr. Morrow?
Or I can talk on an area too if you want me to. If there's an area there that you're interested in, please.
Go ahead, Dr. Redwine.
This is so helpful. Thank you so much. I'm just thinking for those of us who teach Journey, and I'm trying to remember, the students read Exodus and the Book
Genesis.
of Ruth and Genesis.
Genesis.
Is Exodus in Christianity and Culture and Dialogue?
No, Exodus 1 through 24 is in Journey.
Journey.
Then we
So
do
it's
Genesis 12.
Exodus, and the Book of Ruth. Those are the ones, right, that we have in Journey.
Mm-hmm.
So I know many of us on the call either take Journey or teach Journey. And I just wondered, it's funny too, I was teaching A Raisin in the Sun today, the Lorraine Hansberry play. And one of my students said, oh my gosh, this student took Journey last semester. And I do not know why I never noticed that Ruth, the daughter-in-law, is named Ruth in A Raisin in the Sun. And it's such a story of like migration and mother-in-law and daughter. And it blew my mind. And, I've taught it a million times, like probably while I'm teaching Journey, but sometimes it's the students who make us see, So that was an amazing connection one of my students made. So thank you to whoever taught Journey to that student. But I know this is like a huge question, and you can just pick one if you would like, Dr. Morrow, but when we're teaching our Journey classes, where some of the students are Catholic, some are not, some of the Catholic students are very open. Some of the students of all different faiths are very open to the Old Testament. Some have these kind of preconceived notions about it. So I just wondered if you could speak a little bit about I love teaching all three of them, kind of especially the Book of Ruth, they love, but I really enjoy teaching all three of those texts, but I just wondered if you had any thoughts as, since many of us teach those three.
Yeah, sure. The way I just tell you what I try to do, right? And it's not heavily Catholic. It's to get them to read the text. And I want to both show how it's a little bit more complicated than they at first think and what they usually get in whatever background they come from, because it's usually very simplified. and then to show them that they can understand it and that the connections are really, really important. I mean, if you just take Genesis and Ruth right there, I mean, I like to go to the genealogies because this bores the students, but it's really important, right? So you look at Ruth, and I try to show them, where does Ruth come from? She's not an Israelite. She's a Moabite. Well, where does Genesis say the Moabites come from in the life of Abraham? We hear about their origin with Moab, right? Who was the daughter of Lot from his incestuous relations with his daughters. We have Ammon, the Ammonites, and Moab, the Moabites, in this section that we read. And this you can do with Noah, which comes up when I do Christianity, Culture, and Dialogue. So we do Genesis 1 to 11, which I just did recently. Those genealogies are important. So when you do the Noah one, you can show them, Ham has sons. One of them's name is Canaan, from whence come the Canaanites. One is Egypt, where the Egyptians come from. Now, it depends on what translation they're using. If they're using the NRSV that we use, or the RSV, it's Egypt. But if they use the NAB, which a lot of them will use their own NAB, and then it says Mitzrayim. It doesn't translate the name. It just leaves it untranslated in the Hebrew, which is the word for Egypt, Mitzrayim. And so I kind of show them that one of the things these genealogies do is it shows the people, their relationships among each other, right? So that they can understand all of these feuds as a family feud, right? At one level, kind of writ large. And so I try to get them to see connections in the text that I think are helpful. And then we did the Gospel of Luke, but in past journeys, so I've been teaching Journey or Core 2, almost, I think every year, other than my sabbaticals, since the spring of 2010. So my second semester here, I didn't do it in 2009, but I did it in 2010. I think I've done it every year since then. Most semesters, not all. And sometimes we did Matthew, sometimes we did John. We've changed it over the years. When we did Matthew, the genealogy there is very helpful because, of course, you have Ruth mentioned there. But in all of these contexts, I try to show them how this is a little bit more complicated than we might think. And at the same time, it's kind of exciting. Even the parts we might think are boring, there's a lot going on here that we can never kind of plumb its depth. So I try to kind of foster an excitement for the text. They don't always get that. But I did have
That's so helpful because I'm scared of the genealogies. I have to be honest, a little bit. So that's, I love it when like Naomi and Ruth go off together, and I love all those parts myself. So I'm always kind of like a little bit nervous about the genealogies. So now you've inspired me.
Well, especially the end of Ruth, right? Because it links with David, the King David. I mean, so these are all really important. I just think it's, yeah. That's
really helpful. Thank you. My students love the part where she goes and gleans, and like that story really speaks to, and it's we teach Beloved sometimes in Journey by Toni Morrison, and I know Mary Bolkin has done a wonderful presentation for Journey faculty about the connections between Toni Morrison's Beloved and the Book of Ruth. So as an English, those of us in the English department, the Book of Ruth is like such an incredible text for so many of us, but that's really helpful. I do end with that part of Ruth, but you're inspiring me to kind of go back to all those genealogies more next time I teach it. So thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. I mean, there's a lot I can say about, especially in Genesis, but yeah. Todd, you had a hand up?
I see. I don't know, Forrest, if that was you gesturing towards the comment as well. It wasn't. Okay. I don't want to monopolize the time. Father Jerry, I have a question for you, Jeff, but if Father Jerry wants to go next, I don't want to be the one.
No, you go ahead. You go ahead.
And Jeff, you may want to pass on this. You just kind of asked what we would like you to focus on. How does this Catholic guide to the Old Testament deal with those problematic portions of Joshua and the conquest narratives? What looks like genocide at points in Samuel, and where Saul's told to kill everyone and spare no one, and how does the Catholic guide deal with that?
I think I drafted that section. So Scott Hahn and I are doing a book on that topic actually right now. It was part of my sabbatical project. We're still kind of tweaking things, but it's on harem warfare, and it's on reading it in a canonical whole. And so I might be wrong, but I think we deal in that book like a thumbnail of some of what we're going to do there. So that's a really complicated question. And I would say, I'm trying to remember exactly what we do, but I'll tell you how I would respond. And I'll try to keep it simple. So I think there's a couple things that we need to kind of think through when we understand this. And one of the keys to this is what I would call like the divine condescension. Right. So on the one hand, you have the philosophical theodicy type arguments, and I don't want to knock it too much right now, but like Peter Crave, well, because there's truth there, right? And the sense is that, if I were to treat people the way God does, I would go to jail or whatever, right? But the difference is, and this is important, the difference is I can't bring my kid back from the dead if they get hit by a car. I feel like I'm kind of in control. If they have like a scraped knee, I kind of know what's going on. But even that, something might throw you through a loop, get a bacterial infection. But if they're dead, now we're way out of my depth here. But God can save by miracle every single time, and he often does. And he's the author of life, and it's his. So I'm not going to go there, but I also don't want to throw that out. I think more importantly, what we see in the Old Testament is and this gets to that question about, well, God's this angry teenager. From our perspective, we're seeing this on the ground. God's changing his mind. There's the garden, it's paradise. Oh, that didn't work. Kick him out. Okay, then there's the flood, right? Then there's the Passover. Before you get to Harem, you already have the Egyptian firstborns being destroyed by an angel pretty directly, right? God's killing them in Jericho, but like indirectly, right? So you already have a lot of this going on. And the point is what? It's to bring family union with God. Did it work with the Garden of Eden? No. Did the flood fix everything? No. We got the Tower of Babel after that. We got all these things. Did the wiping out of people in the conquest do it? No. Right? So part of the point from a Christian perspective would be the answer is Jesus, right? And his own suffering on the cross out of love for us. But it doesn't get at what's going on in Joshua, why this command. And I am really persuaded by an article that John Bergsma and Scott Hahn published in the Journal of Biblical Literature back in 2004. And it's a reading of Ezekiel 20, what laws were not good. In Ezekiel 20, right, God says, I gave them laws that were not good. But what laws did God give that were not good? This was a really highly contested issue. And I think they found the clue in that, most scholars will say, well, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, that's all after the exile, Ezekiel's in the exile. But he does that. They show how Ezekiel has a very careful reading of not just the stories but the texts of Deuteronomy and Leviticus, right? The whole thing. And he's pitting Deuteronomy against Leviticus. Like in Leviticus, you have to do good to the foreigner in your midst. If they don't follow, we can drive them out. I'm going to, and in Deuteronomy, kill everybody. And this is also the context for the laws of divorce. You have the context which is most upsetting to Ezekiel, and that is the profane slaughter of animals, right? Now you can just kill animals, right? And so what's going on is a lowering of the bar. This is what you might talk about as the deuterosis. It's a lowering the bar because of the hardness of the heart of the people. It's kind of like it's a little bit, I'm going to give a trite example, but it's kind of like no phones. The kids aren't, 18, they're going to have phones, no iPhones, no nothing, right? And then the pressures come in, you're kind of like, all right, okay. We'll try the phone thing out, but here's the rules. You got it. Now, if you don't follow the rules, let's have a contract. Write this out. Okay, you broke the rule. You know what I'm saying? So you're kind of lowering the bar a little bit. Now, obviously, death is a lot more extreme. I don't want to make light of that. But there's something like that going on here, I think. And so what does God tell Moses? You make a covenant with the people. So Deuteronomy, in a real way, is Moses making a covenant with the people. That's what the text says. And God is backing that. You have this wayward people that are not following. Okay, Moses, you make a covenant with the people, and they're going to honor this, and I'm going to honor that. And so what Joshua is doing then is because the ultimate fear is that the people, wherever they go, they're not bringing the people into right worship with God. They're worshiping the false gods of the nations. So even in the Deuteronomic decree that Joshua is trying to fulfill, that's the concern. Because the whole point, and I know this is long-winded, so I apologize. Don't forget your questions. But I have the mic, so I'm going to take the time. I really think people misunderstand Deuteronomy because you often hear this Deuteronomic theology. It's the health and wealth gospel. You do good, good will happen. It's like Job's friends. You do bad, bad will happen. If bad happened, well, you must have sinned. That's not Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is very clear. For those of you under the Deuteronomic covenant, it's not forever, it's not everybody. Right? Here are the blessings for obedience. Here are the curses for disobedience, right? If you do this, this will happen if you don't. But then a chapter later, it says, And when these things come upon you, the blessings and the curses, right, you will convert and I will bring you back. So it's showing God's fidelity despite the infidelity to people. Ultimately, they're going to get cursed and blessed. Okay. And then what we see is they don't fulfill the harem warfare laws anyways.
Mhm.
So it's a complicated question, but what I would say is it's a lowering of the bar because of the hardness of the heart of the people, which is consistent with the interpretation of the rabbis on divorce
Mhm.
and Jesus on divorce. So harem and divorce are related in Deuteronomy. That's my short answer.
Thank you, Jeff.
Monsignor.
This is a really a simple question. It's really something I've known and I've just forgotten. But, I know in some ways Christians view Daniel as one of 4 great prophets. And in Judaism, Daniel's classified, and I know it's a much later writing, but as one of the writings. And yeah, I'm thinking about why. Now, maybe to some degree, although Daniel will predict future, he doesn't seem to speak as much about the practice of the people and critique of the practice of the people as Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel. But maybe that has nothing to do with the categorization. I don't know.
Well, I'm not 100% sure. They certainly don't do it based on dating, because traditionally in Judaism, they dated it to the Babylonian exile. That's a much, although Porphyry and some of the critics were putting it late as prophecy after the fact. In Judaism, the tradition in all forms of Judaism and Christianity were traditionally that this was Babylonian and not second century. But I think so it's not in the Nevi'im, it's not in the prophets in Judaism, it's in the Ketuvim, it's among the writings. And I don't know for sure, but I think most of it is, if you look at the books of the Ketuvim, at least the major prophets, they tend to be focused on oracles, oracles against Israel, oracles against the nations. Think of like the great prophets, Jeremiah, right? Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. So we number them right after that. And they, with the Lamentations, obviously, in Baruch. And in the Tanakh, in the Jewish tradition, he's with the writings. He's not seen as one of the great prophets. So I think it has. I don't know for sure, but my guess is it has more to do with the lack of oracles.
Okay.
As opposed to, because the prophecy really isn't just about future prediction, as
Right.
I know but in this context, I think it had to do with the oracles against the kings.
Yeah.
Matt?
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. I'm excited to get this and read it, because you mentioned the Bible in your podcast, which when it first came out, it was during Lent, and so that was my Lenten thing that year. My one question for the book, though, is is there kind of like a spiritual element or a practical element to each of the sections or each of the books, like how this applies to your life, or it's more how do I read, how do I dive into Scripture as a Catholic?
Yeah, there may be some exceptions, but overall, it's more about a general introduction. It's really for Catholics that feel intimidated by the Old Testament. This is meant of a way of making it less intimidating, so that they can have a better map of how to kind of get through this, because it is tricky. That's one of the things I really think is important. Is, on the one hand, I think I want my students to recognize this is complicated stuff. Interpreting the Bible is very complicated. There's a reason there's all these different interpretations out there. And on the other hand, I don't want them to be pushed away. I want them to recognize that this is exciting and it's for them, right? That we believe, that's why it's canonized together. That's why we believe it's inspired, that it's for us. It's not a book for scholars, but the more you bring to the table, the more you're going to get out of it. Right, the more that you're going to spend time with the text, the more you're going to get out of it. The better you know the languages, the more you can get out of it. And then I would go one further and say, the more it has a claim on your life, the more you're going to get out of it. But all those things, those tools are all important. And so this is just one tool to help kind of average Catholic readers, get a little better sense of what's going on. Who are these people? I take so much for granted. I was talking to some friends, faithful Catholics. And we're talking about the Babylonian exile, the Assyrian exile. They don't even know what those are. And I take that such for granted, because it's just like, I remember coming to college as a freshman, and I didn't know Jesus's resurrection, and about that. I didn't know how Easter had anything to do with that. I didn't know much about, I knew a little bit about the Old Testament, just growing up Jewish, but I wouldn't have known what the Babylonian exile is. But you forget over time, when it becomes so much a part of your landscape, the Assyrian exile, King David, Solomon, some of the chronologies, it seems so basic, and it's not. For a lot of people, they don't even know, they couldn't put the order of, Adam, Noah, Abraham, Moses, David. They couldn't even put that in order, chronologically. And so this is to help people like that get a better sense of the order and how this all fits. Actually, I've been doing a lot of these interviews on the radio. It's like 8 o'clock in the morning, these live interviews in Cincinnati, Ohio. It's like we do a live one and then 2 recorded ones. And they're at, some of the interviewers asking all these questions. And it's just interesting to think through, because it's based on this book and different Old Testament books, just how much it helps to have a basic context of this is before the exile. This is the significance of the exile. This is after the exile. And I don't mean when scholars place these things, I mean the stories, because that's important to the story, what the story is trying to do, right? So like whether or not Israelites were ever in Egypt, I think they were, but whether or not they were ever there, if you assume, to understand what's going on in the Exodus, you have to understand the significance of Egypt and of the slavery and of the liberation. And then for the New Testament, Luke especially, you got to understand what Luke is doing. So Luke alone in the Transfiguration has the text say that Moses and Elijah was talking to, I think that most of the English says departure, but in the Greek it says Moses and Elijah were talking to Jesus about the exodos that he's about to go on, the Exodus, which I think we translate usually departure. But I mean, they're making connections with these texts that it's really important to kind of make those connections. That's what we're doing, I hope.
Great, thank you.
Any other questions? Can I ask you one?
Sure.
So I had you as an undergrad and grad. My experience was, that I was usually the only woman. And my classmates were seminarians. Were you teaching these young men? Eventually, God's willing, they will become priests. I know how you teach because I learned it from you, teaching scripture. But what is your experience when you teach lay students? Like, I do it because this is the way I learn it. And I teach on typology. Do you do that?
So it depends.
Small examples.
It all depends on my audience. So I don't make the lay distinction as much as like a mixed crowd, right? So if I'm talking to a lay audience, like at a parish, I try to make it more understandable. I may not do a good job at this. I don't know. It's hard for me to know sometimes what I'm assuming and not. But I try to make this. I actually lectured on this book in Advent. I did a series of three maybe lectures at a parish. Maybe it was 4. I can't remember. But it was on this kind of how the Old Testament prepares us for Christ. So that was very typological. So if I'm talking to a lay audience where it's at a parish, or this is about some connection to their faith, I will bring up typology or something like that. If it's a core course, I don't usually do that, except the exception is when we get to the binding of Isaac. There might be another exception, but we do the binding of Isaac, maybe the Passover. I do talk about Jewish interpretations and Christian, right? And Catholic. I mean, in the sense of not to distinguish Catholics from Christians, but in the sense of, like with the Passover, Christians in general point forward to Jesus' sacrifice. Catholics in more sacramental traditions, like the Orthodox, will also link this with the Eucharist specifically. So I try to get them to see how these texts are like really important. Genesis 22 is really important in Judaism. It's really important in Christianity, and for different but related reasons, because in Judaism, a lot of these promises are focused on the Passover, because of how significant that becomes in Judaism, and the temple. But in Christianity, Jesus is seen as the fulfillment of both the Passover and he's the new temple. So the degree to which that's important in Judaism, it becomes even more important or as important in Christianity. So I try to do that. So if I'm doing it to an audience where they might be Muslim, I have Muslim students, I have Hindu students, I have agnostic students. I try to talk about it in terms of the history of interpretation, because it shows the significance of these texts for different communities, right? I'll even bring up, the binding of Isaac, in Muslim communities, the tradition that is Ishmael, right? And there's a lot of confusion with that. So I have to explain that these texts are not inspired in Islam, but the people who are spoken of in these texts are also spoken of in the Muslim tradition, that these are prophets in Islam. And so they're also important, so they overlap. So it depends on my audience, I try to tailor it to the audience as best as I can.
Thank you, Dr. Enright.
Well, I think we're just getting towards the end. I just was wondering if any of the students have any questions?
Sure.
Not to put you on the spot, but you're not too shy in class. I don't, just jump in if you have a question for Dr. Morrow.
I won't
Anybody?
bite. I promise I won't bite.
All right. Well, we don't
That's
have to, if maybe they, but if you think of something later, you can always email me and he's very kind. I'm sure I could forward it to you, Dr.
Sure, of
Morrow.
course.
This was really, really amazing. And I just want to thank you. There's, I've been taking notes. I thought the whole talk was amazing, but that distinction between the Deuteronomical and the Levitical differentiation is very interesting.
I highly recommend reading the article. It was 2004. I mean, Scott came up with this, and he did a presentation at an international SBL, and I think it was Walter Zimmerly. One of these guys came up to him afterwards and just said, "I've been working on this 20 years. I think you figured this out. How the heck did you do this?" And then John Bergsman, him, put it together. And JBL, which is the top journal probably in scholarship, published it. It's called "What Laws Were Not Good." It was in 2004. It's wonderful. And if you want a simpler version, in his published dissertation on in 2009, Kinship by Covenant, that Yale published, there's a short section there. In fact, I can email you.
I'd really appreciate that, because it just interesting to me personally in my own scholars, biblical studies, but just even for class. Because I think that is so fascinating. And I also, what you said, we're saying about the gleaning in Ruth, because I was just talking about that with someone, how do we do that today? Most of us don't farm and leave, but we got to do the same principle, and you carry the principles over. So I just thought that was fascinating. I just want to say, I really enjoyed your talk. I've heard your talk before, but as you were speaking, I remember the first time I think I ever heard your name mentioned, and that was about 15 years ago in a Core 2. And I had a student who now has since become a priest, Father Danny Pabon.
Oh,
And
sure.
remember Danny? And I
Yeah,
know Maribel knows him very well.
He's already
Right?
been ordained, isn't he still a student?
He's an amazing young man. But I just wanted to say, he said to me, I have this brilliant professor in the seminary, Dr. Jeff Morrow, and he was so enthusiastic about you. And it just, you really have lived up to it, certainly today, because I remember I heard you lecture since then several times, but it's always very rich, always very beautiful. But I remember that description by this young man who was a sophomore, and he was just so excited about your class.
Well, thank you. Gosh, it seems like yesterday I had him in class, but thank you so much.
I know, me too. We're both getting up there, right? Because it feels like I just had, and he's now, Maribel, you go to church sometimes with him, right?
He's my pastor. He's in
That's
St.
incredible.
Leo's.
Oh,
He's in St. Leo's, and my grandchildren, he was in St. Anastasia in Teaneck, and my grandchildren adore him. But then they move him to where I was, that Gabriel Curtis was.
Well, it's wonderful, the impact that the seminary has. I mean, Father Jerry's here, and you Jeff, it's you impact lives. And so anyway, we just want to thank you so much. This was wonderful. And as Maribel said, we're ordering the book for the core. We're going to have a couple copies so people can read it, and I will definitely check out the 2 articles that you mentioned. And thank you so much.
It's indirect on the cherem, but it gives you the whole principle. So I'll email that to you.
Oh, that'd be great. Thank you so much. And I can share that with the group of the people that were here as well. So anyway, thank you so much, Dr. Morrow. I think everybody was just really, really inspired, and thanks everybody for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Morrow.
Thank you, Monsignor.
Bye.
Thank you
Take
so
care.
much, Dr. Morrow. I learned so much. Thank you.
Thank you. See everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.